What is the deadliest job in America? Well, according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor, the most hazardous occupation fluctuates between logging and commercial fishing. In any given year, these industries can expect about 1 out of every 1,000 workers to die on the job. Of all the possible career paths in modern America, this is pretty much as deadly as it gets. Unless, of course, you're willing to think outside of the box. Because in the United States, there is one job whose fatality rate towers far beyond the others.
See, it can be growth. Income is exactly right. Very well done. Yes.
Across 250 years of our nation's history, only 45 men have ever had the honor of being president. And of these 45 men, 8 have died on the job, representing a fatality rate of more than 17%. To put it another way, getting elected president is roughly equivalent to playing Russian roulette with one bullet loaded in the chamber. Out of everyone sworn into the Oval Office thus far, 1 out of 6 would not live to see the end of their term. If you're misfortunate enough to die as the president, your legacy will go down in one of two ways. You will either be immortalized within the essential fabric of our nation, or you will be quietly forgotten as if you never even existed. Whichever outcome you receive will mostly depend on your cause of death. If you die of natural causes, almost no one will remember you, and those who do may only ridicule you. This was the case with the very first president to die in office, William Henry Harrison, someone who was evidently quite eager to lead the nation, as he concocted the longest inauguration speech in American history. Unfortunately, this may have directly contributed to the shortest presidency in American history. After speaking for 2 hours in the frigid rain, Harrison soon caught pneumonia and died just a month into his term. In the present day, anyone who knows him only knows him for this. Zachary Taylor was the next president to bite the dust in office. Just 16 months in, he contracted an intestinal disease after drinking some rancid milk and died shortly after. He is another president who has been almost entirely forgotten by the American public. If anything, he was better remembered for his distinguished military career than anything he did in the White House. The same cannot be said for Warren G. Harding, who was somehow even more of an afterthought than Taylor, despite serving nearly a century closer to our time. He died of a heart attack 2 years into his term. But as it turns out, not all sick and dying presidents are doomed to be forgotten. Franklin D. Roosevelt passed away in 1945 due to complications from polio, and he went on to become one of the few presidents immortalized on legal tender that Americans see every day. However, FDR's legacy is certainly a special case. Not only was he the longest-serving president in American history, but he happened to guide the nation through 2 of its biggest crises of the 20th century. His political accomplishments overshadowed his eventual death to such an extent that I suspect most Americans today aren't even aware that he died in office. The truth is that people don't want to remember their greatest leaders as sickly and feeble. They want to remember a hero, someone who made the ultimate sacrifice for the ultimate job. That distinction belongs to a separate classification of presidential deaths. Of the 8 presidents who died on the job, half were assassinated. This was the case with 2 of the most dramatic moments in the history of American politics. Elected a century apart, Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy would both meet the same grisly fate, being executed by a lone gunman in full view of the adoring public. Lincoln's death represented the culmination of the most divisive war ever fought on U.S. soil. Kennedy's death and the dubious events surrounding it sowed the modern age of paranoia and distrust in the clandestine institutions that rule over us. By all measures, these were 2 of the most critical turning points in the long and winding story of this nation. The men who paid the price for these unspeakable tragedies have been memorialized for the foreseeable future. However, not all presidential assassinations are remembered equally. Far more obscure than the demise of Lincoln and Kennedy was the murder of William McKinley. Although he met more or less the same fate as the others, his death went on to receive far less notoriety over time. This may have to do with how McKinley existed in an awkward middle ground of US history, too late to be considered foundational and too early to have any relevance within modern politics. At the very least, he did end up getting a notable mountain named after him, so he hasn't been completely lost to time. Oddly enough, McKinley, Lincoln, and JFK actually have something else in common. They are each part of what may be America's most bizarre historical coincidence. Starting with Lincoln in 1860, each successive president elected in a 20-year interval would suffer a sudden and untimely death in office. This pattern would persist for a century, finally ending with the 1980 election winner Ronald Reagan, who famously survived an assassination attempt. This mystifying trend has arguably shaped the very groundwork of the nation we see today. Each of these men, no matter how important or irrelevant, played their part in altering the course of our destiny. But wait a minute, isn't there someone else you're forgetting? If you happen to be murdered while working the most important job in the nation, you'd think it would be a pretty big deal. You'd think that future generations would at least remember you in some capacity. But remarkably enough, that is apparently not the case. James A. Garfield was assassinated while in office, and he is somehow in contention for the most forgotten president in US history. At least some presidents like Millard Fillmore are ironically remembered for being so forgettable, but Garfield doesn't even have that. He's not taught in schools, he's not brought up by modern talking heads, he was not even included in the Simpsons musical number about forgotten presidents. His very name has been completely overshadowed by an orange cartoon cat who eats lasagna. For most of my life, I had known that there was a President Garfield. I knew he had a beard, I knew he existed in that same awkward part of American history as McKinley, but beyond that, I couldn't really tell you anything about him. It was only very recently that I found out he was assassinated at all, which you'd imagine would be a fairly significant detail. I mean, really, doesn't it seem odd that we had a president who was murdered in office and no one today seems to know it even happened? How can this possibly be the case? At first, I suspected that it must be some insidious deep state cover-up designed to blind us from the truth. But no, pretty much all the information there is to know about the incident is readily available, and any political motives that may have once existed for such a scheme have surely been rendered obsolete. Maybe this particular presidential assassination just happened to be especially boring and unremarkable. A complete oxymoron if you think about it. In the modern age, our appetite for true crime stories has never been greater. And what could be a bigger crime than killing the president? Why would anything like this be swept under the rug? When I started looking into it, I quickly found out why. This whole catastrophe and everything leading up to it deserved to be forgotten, because it might just be the dumbest series of events that has ever transpired in the history of American politics. I understand that this is a bold claim to make, especially in modern times, but rest assured, by the end of this tale, many of you will have no choice but to reach the same conclusion. This is the story of how the most brilliant president we've ever had was killed by stupidity. James Abram Garfield was born in 1831 at what was then the edge of the American frontier. He came into this world in abject poverty, the youngest of 5 children all living in a log cabin on the outskirts of the wilderness. When he was just 2 years old, his father dropped dead after using every last ounce of his strength to defend the property from a forest fire. As a boy, Garfield dreamed of sailing the seas. Not long after, he would come pretty close to doing just that, taking a job as a ship worker on the Erie Canal. Then one treacherous night, he was flung overboard into the chilling darkness below. His cries for help went unheard by the rest of the crew. Flailing around in the swirling, choppy water, the young Garfield was completely and utterly alone. Then, by some miracle, his hand grasped onto a single wayward rope dangling off the boat. He pulled himself to safety and lived to see another day. Nearly every moment of Garfield's life would be surrounded by death, but back then, that was pretty much business as usual. 19th century America wasn't exactly the most pleasant place to live. Disease ran rampant, violence was common, and working conditions were brutal. These factors contributed to a life expectancy as low as 40 by the middle of the century. It was practically impossible to go through life without being constantly exposed to death and tragedy. Surprisingly, many Americans would actually take pride in these harsh realities. The United States has always been guided by individual excellence. We romanticize this idea of finding diamonds in the rough, praying that somewhere out there in a sea of suffering and mediocrity, the truly brilliant among us will emerge and lead the rest of us to prosperity. Our heroes cannot simply be created. They must be forged through the chaos and dysfunction of American life. Sure, we sacrifice a great deal of collective welfare along the way, but when you finally find that diamond, nothing else can compare. James A. Garfield is that diamond, and it wouldn't be long before he started shining. Following his near-death experience, the young Garfield undergoes a religious revival. He becomes an unwavering man of faith and finds himself with a new sense of purpose. He is now determined to fulfill his mother's lifelong wish of getting a formal education. At the age of 19, he enrolls at a nearby college, having to work as a janitor to afford his tuition. But despite his humble origins, Garfield would quickly establish himself as a brilliant student. After only a year, the school had already hired him as a teacher. He soon develops a talent for public speaking, and before long was able to hold a crowd in the palm of his hand. His newfound thirst for knowledge would bring him to the prestigious Williams College in Massachusetts, his first exposure to a broader view of the American people. Returning to rural Ohio with a rare East Coast degree, Garfield was already one of the most distinguished men in the state. In 1859, at the age of 28, he was elected to his first political role in the Ohio State Senate. Just over a year later, the nation erupted in civil war, and Garfield left his seat to fight for the Union. He ended up leading a brigade of troops into the Battle of Middle Creek. Although he was outmanned, outgunned, and totally inexperienced, he would successfully repel the Confederate forces through superior tactics. But despite the glory of victory, while scanning the aftermath of the battle, Garfield was overcome with a profound sadness. His gambit had cost the lives of countless men, many of whom he had personally recruited from his own hometown. The stillness of those fallen soldiers haunted him, and forever changed his perspective on the sanctity of life. After the battle, Garfield was promoted to general. News of his military triumph quickly spread, and propelled him to a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives as part of the nation Republican Party. But just as he reached another milestone, tragedy would strike him once again. Shortly before taking office, he lost his 3-year-old daughter Eliza. Distraught with grief, he started to reconsider his political career. But after Abraham Lincoln insisted he stay, Garfield would make his best effort to serve the nation. When evaluating politicians from this time period, you'd expect to encounter a litany of archaic and backwards views. But in this regard, Garfield was surprisingly progressive even by our modern standards. A radical abolitionist, he fought to end slavery and preserve the suffrage and civil rights of freed men. From his own life experience, he knew that dedicated people could rise from nothing if given the opportunity, and thus fought for the rights of the oppressed and downtrodden. In another rare sight for men in his position, Garfield had seemingly no interest in climbing the political ladder. He was perfectly content with the spot he was in, unwilling to pursue any greater power or prestige. Garfield would remain in Congress for 17 years. Over that time, he became widely respected by his peers, known throughout the Capitol as a man of great honor and quite the skilled orator. He would also try his hand at practicing law, at times defending men who had no one else on their side. He kept up with academics too, at one point submitting an original proof of the Pythagorean theorem just for fun. And away from Washington, he spent most of his days humoring his wife and kids on the family farm back in Ohio. Life was good, but soon enough, everything would take an unexpected turn. Following the Civil War, the newly formed Republican Party enjoyed a crushing grip over Congress and the presidency, but as the years went on, their plans start to go south. In the 1876 election, the Democrats had the Republicans dead to rights. It was here that many believed the two parties cut a deal. A never-before-seen electoral commission awarded all the remaining votes to Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes, who won the election by the smallest margin in U.S. history. In exchange, the Hayes administration withdrew all federal troops from the former Confederacy, effectively ending Reconstruction and leaving civil rights issues in the South unresolved for the next century. By 1880, the Republican Party is close to imploding from constant infighting. Hostilities have broken out between two rival factions: Garfield's side, the half-breeds who want civil service reform, and the stalwarts who want to continue a tradition of political patronage known as the spoils system. In the US during this time, it was common for presidential administrations to reward their biggest donors with powerful positions in the government, and thus, winning elections was used as a means of personal enrichment for yourself and your cronies. This is otherwise known as blatant corruption, and totally undermines the values of a free democracy which is supposed to reward merit. The stalwarts are led by a senator from New York named Roscoe Conkling, who over the years has built America's single biggest political machine in New York City. Conkling is arguably the most powerful politician in the country, using his influence to sabotage the entire Hayes presidency after he refused to fall in line. The half-breeds are led by Conkling's sworn enemy James G. Blaine, who wants to dismantle the spoils system once and for all. This heated power struggle comes to a head at the 1880 Republican Convention. The two frontrunners for the nomination are Blaine and Conkling's choice for president, Ulysses S. Grant. The former Union general had already spent 2 terms in the White House and had agreed to stay out of Conkling's way. Attending the convention is James A. Garfield, but only to campaign on someone else's behalf. You see, Garfield has no desire to become president. In fact, he views the lust for the presidency as a spiritually destructive force that can only lead to doom and ruination. Today, his only job is to pledge his support for fellow Ohioan John Sherman. The endorsement makes little difference, however, as the Republican delegates simply cannot decide on a candidate. The three-way split leaves each prospect well short of the majority required for nomination, and so, the convention is forced to re-vote over and over again until a winner is decided. The stalemate extends past 10, 20, and eventually 30 ballots, but then, an extraordinary development starts to take place. Several delegates from all around the country begin casting their votes for Garfield. With each additional ballot, his support grows higher and higher. Disturbed by what he was seeing, Garfield tries insisting to the convention that he's not a participant in this race, but his protests fall on deaf ears. Even more delegates start to join in on the stampede, and eventually, Blaine and Sherman throw in the towel. It's all coming up Garfield. When the dust settles on the 36th ballot, he stands at a total of 399 votes. James A. Garfield has just become the Republican nominee after never even agreeing to be a candidate. He is now possibly the only person in US history who is being forced to run for president against his will. And then he won. Congratulations to James A. Garfield, the 20th President of the United States. Despite facing a dead heat in the popular vote, he wins the Electoral College by a fairly comfortable margin. This is quite impressive, considering he did practically nothing in terms of a campaign. In fact, he never left his farm during the entire election cycle. But despite this, the rest of the nation had started to become enamored with Garfield's story. After going from penniless and fatherless to the most powerful civil servant in all the land, he practically embodied the American dream, and people from all walks of life began to rally around him. When he finally learned of his victory, Garfield felt pride in vindicating his supporters, but on a personal level, he couldn't shake the feeling of sadness that the simple pastoral life he desired was suddenly over. He was now expected to climb what he described as a bleak mountain. The presidency may not have been good for Garfield, but Garfield was undoubtedly good for the presidency. The fact that he never wanted the job actually reveals why he was the perfect man for the job. He now has the rare opportunity to fulfill what has long been considered impossible, the myth of the truly noble president. In the modern age, we view this idea as some kind of vague abstraction. For as much as they try to fool us into believing otherwise, we all know deep down that the men who become president are not ordinary people like you and I. Their job is to toe the line for the most powerful institutions in society, not to have a beer with a bunch of blue-collar workers. The truth is that modern-day presidents tend to be money-hungry, power-hungry, and totally out of touch with the people they rule over. And this is precisely what makes James A. Garfield significant, because he actually made it to the White House while maintaining his real, honest-to-God integrity. He is modest, conscientious, and understands the plight of the less fortunate because he personally lived through it. In an age of darkness and corruption, this ridiculous political circus of ours accidentally gave us a hero, someone who was truly brilliant in both intellect and character. If all goes well, a leader like this has the potential to guide our nation into a new golden age. At long last, we have finally found our diamond. Now, it's time to meet the rough. On June 11, 1880, a terrible tragedy occurs on the Long Island Sound. While navigating through dense fog, two passenger ships suffer a head-on collision. More than 50 people drown or burn to death in the ensuing fire. One man, however, makes it out of the calamity completely unscathed. His name is Charles Guiteau. Hardly anyone knows who he is at this point, but that won't be the case for much longer. In many ways, Guiteau could be described as an anti-Garfield. He was also born into abject poverty and raised by a single father instead of a single mother. While Garfield grew up to be a tall man with broad shoulders, Guiteau maintained a short and frail stature. Both men were devout Christians, but while Garfield practiced his faith with grace and humility, Guiteau quickly slipped into radical fanaticism. This was mostly due to the influence of his father, who moved the family to a polyamorous commune in upstate New York. While the young Guiteau enjoyed the idea of free love, he did not enjoy the volunteer labor required to live on the grounds. And so, after falling out with the rest of the community, he set off on his own path. By this point, Garfield had taken on a life of great sacrifice, whether through teaching, military combat, or public service. Guiteau happened to take a different route that basically involved scamming everyone who crossed paths with him. His lifestyle resembled what we now know as a grifter, someone who'd be willing to sell the world and then act confused when there's nowhere left to spend the money. At first, he becomes a lawyer, perhaps taking after his brother-in-law, the person in his life most willing to loan him money that he'd never repay. During this time, there was essentially no barrier of entry to practicing law, which many of Guiteau's clients found out the hard way. His behavior in the courtroom was considered by many as a bit unhinged, and any argument he made was often totally incoherent. On the rare occasions he actually won some kind of settlement for his clients, he would pocket the money for himself and skip town. Once it becomes clear that the legal profession isn't working out for him, Guiteau tries his hand as a traveling evangelist. He wanders from city to city, hopping on trains without paying for tickets and staying in hotels without paying for rooms. He publishes an alternative Bible which was almost entirely plagiarized from some other zealot. He desperately tries to convince passerbys to attend his lectures. Very few would, and those who did pretty much always regretted their decision. Guiteau's constant lies and recklessness did get him arrested on several occasions, but the punishment was never enough to deter him from trying again. He keeps this up for over a decade, jumping to town after town, working scheme after scheme, and all the while, he never once suspects that he's doing anything wrong. Charles Guiteau was likely suffering from what we now know as antisocial personality disorder, characterized by a profound lack of empathy for others and the inability to distinguish between right and wrong. People like this seek constant stimulation of their own ego at the expense of others. They are often drawn to positions in society that inflate their sense of self-importance. Most people who ever encountered Guiteau could immediately tell that there was something wrong with him. A family doctor even recommended that he be institutionalized, but no one could afford to pay the bills. And so, Charles Guiteau was left to roam free in society, eventually winding up where most people like him do, the wonderful world of politics. In 1880, Right around the time of the Republican convention, Guiteau develops a fascination with Roscoe Conkling and the Stalwarts. This was probably because their corrupt nature aligned quite well with his own personal values. After learning about the spoils system, Guiteau hatches his greatest scheme yet. He will help a stalwart get elected and subsequently be rewarded with a position of political power. And so, he cobbles together what could be described as a speech in support of General Grant, the presumptive nominee. But after Garfield emerges as a dark horse candidate, Guiteau has to make some major modifications. He pretty much just crosses out Grant's name and haphazardly replaces it with Garfield's. This literary masterpiece is going to be Guiteau's ticket straight to the top. He travels to the Republican Party headquarters in New York City and passes out copies of his speech to anyone he comes across. He spends the next several months orbiting around the rest of the party sycophants, and then in November he hears the good news. Garfield has been elected president, and Charles Guiteau believes that he is personally responsible for the victory. After the inauguration in March, he heads to the White House to accept whichever important government position that Garfield has handpicked for him. But when he gets there, he finds that he's not alone. It turns out that hundreds of other deadbeats from all over the country have also showed up to the White House lobby to beg for a job. Garfield's personal secretary, Joseph Stanley Brown, has been instructed to let them down gently. He thanks the applicants for their interest and assures them that their requests have been taken into consideration, when truthfully, none of them has a snowball's chance in hell of actually getting what they desire. But as the weeks go by and the crowd eventually thins out, Guiteau doesn't seem to get the memo. He keeps showing up to the White House in his shabby, tattered suit, expecting his job offer to arrive at any moment. Eventually, he gets a bit impatient. He starts tracking down various high-ranking Republicans and badgering them over when the president is planning to appoint him. Shockingly, this does little to help his situation. Every time he's ignored, Guiteau gets more and more desperate. After 2 months of loitering, he finally gets banned from the White House lobby. That same day, he runs into James G. Blaine, whom Garfield has promoted to Secretary of State. After sitting through Guiteau's non-stop pestering, Blaine loses his temper, storming away and demanding that he never speak to him again. Guiteau's fragile psyche can no longer cope with this level of rejection, and his intentions turn cruel. He has been utterly humiliated, and it's all Garfield's fault. He realizes now what he has to do to set things right. In the meantime, the Garfield administration has gotten off to a promising start. Soon after taking office, he refinances the national debt, saving taxpayers millions. This is a kind of fiscal responsibility that we rarely see with our modern politicians, who prefer to push our budgetary burden down the road to future generations. Unlike them, many of Garfield's policies actually demonstrate a bit of forward thinking. He begins the process of modernizing America's naval fleet with the construction of steel ships. This may come in handy if a war were to break out in the vast archipelagos of the Pacific in, say, 60 years or so. Garfield also lays out a proposal for universal free education, intending to give everyone access to the very instrument of his success. This one might be a bit of an uphill battle to get on the books, but if Congress puts their minds to it, they can surely get it done in the near future. However, Garfield's most pressing issue is fighting off the corruption of the stalwart faction. At first, Conkling tries to intimidate the president into backing down, but Garfield pretty much ignores him and moves forward with his plans. He appoints one of Conkling's many enemies to a prominent role in his New York City machine. Incensed, the senator uses his many media connections to drum up some slander against Garfield in the press. Public opinion mostly sides with the president, however, as they too have grown sick of the corruption. Unwilling to concede this fight, Conkling resorts to drastic measures. In one final protest against the appointment, he makes the decision to resign from the Senate. His idea is to inspire a wave of passion and solidarity amongst his faction, and afterwards simply reclaim his seat through re-election. Unfortunately for Conkling, he has greatly underestimated how little people care to see him go. The years of bullying and theatrics have finally caught up to him, and after this stunt, he is essentially laughed out of the building. His gambit has completely backfired in every possible way. To add insult to injury, he even fails to get re-elected, and his career is over just like that. In only a couple of months, Garfield has toppled his greatest political threat by doing almost nothing. But after all of this, Conkling still has one trick up his sleeve, because within the Garfield administration, he has embedded a poison pill. His name is Chester Arthur, the Vice President of the United States. For years, Arthur had served exclusively as Conkling's political minion. For his efforts, he was rewarded with a cushy city job and an exorbitant salary. Thus far, this had been the only political office he ever held. Arthur was added to the presidential ticket as a means of placating the stalwarts, but was otherwise intended to pose no threat to Garfield's leadership. Conkling, however, was more than thrilled to have a man on the inside. Arthur was about as loyal of a subject as he could choose, and if, of course, Garfield was somehow removed from office, Conkling would essentially have his own personal puppet leading the nation. But honestly, what are the odds of that happening? On June 6, 1881, Charles Guiteau purchases a handgun. He heads down to the Potomac River and practices his aim on a small sapling. As he lines up the barrel, he envisions precisely one man as his target. After weeks of paranoid delusions, Guiteau now believes that God has commanded him to kill the president. He begins stalking Garfield all around the city, making note of his routine and daily schedule. He soon discovers where Garfield goes to church every Sunday and plans to dispatch of him there. On June 12th, he finds the president sitting in his familiar spot with his family next to an open window. Guiteau steps outside and walks to the window with his loaded gun. He has a clear shot to the back of Garfield's head, but before he pulls the trigger, he gets distracted by the sermon inside the building. The pastor apparently offends Guiteau's delicate religious sensibilities, causing him to head back inside and start a belligerent argument in front of the whole congregation. Garfield directly witnesses this outburst, later referring to Guiteau as a dull man with a loud voice. He eventually leaves the service in peace, and Guiteau has to regroup and try again. Throughout this whole assassination plot, Guiteau was not exactly discreet. He sent threatening letters to the White House which no one bothered to read. He toured the prison where he expected to be sent after the crime. He even just loudly revealed his presence right in front of his target, but Garfield somehow doesn't recognize him as the same lunatic who's been loitering around the White House for months. I guess Charles Guiteau has already spent his whole life getting ignored, so why would it stop now? Guiteau's next attempt would come 6 days later at the Baltimore and Potomac train station. There, Garfield was escorting his wife Lucretia, who was departing on vacation. Guiteau was in position and fully prepared to carry out his plan, but upon seeing the First Lady step out of the presidential carriage, something unusual happened. For possibly the only moment in his adult life, Charles Guiteau experienced a single shred of empathy. Lucretia had been recently recovering from a near-fatal illness, leaving her with a thin and frail appearance. She clung on to her husband as they walked right past Guiteau, who decided that he could not carry out the assassination in this fashion. Killing the president is one thing, but doing so in front of his wife, now that's just cruel. Despite a second close encounter with his deranged stalker, Garfield still couldn't sense that he was in any sort of danger. Just a few days later, fate itself tried to warn him. On June 30th, the president met with his Secretary of War Robert Todd Lincoln, son of the late Abraham Lincoln. Sometime during the conversation, Robert divulged that his father once had a prophetic dream about his own assassination. Garfield himself suffered from paranoia that he too would die an early death. He thought about his father, who sacrificed his life so that the people he loved could prosper, and often contemplated whether he would be forced to repeat the cycle. The next day, Garfield decides to pay a visit to Secretary Blaine. The two have a discussion while taking a nice, fully exposed stroll through the open streets of the city. Neither of them notice the man in the shabby, tattered suit who has been following them around the whole time with a loaded gun. If they turned around at any moment, they probably would have recognized him. By now, both Garfield and Blaine have had memorable experiences with this fellow. After all, it was Blaine's scolding of Guiteau which sent him on this downward mental spiral to begin with. Seeing Garfield act so friendly with him only enrages Guiteau further. These two scoundrels have deprived him of everything he deserves. He could kill them both if he wanted to, but once again, he hesitates, and they retreat into the White House. That night, Guiteau seethes at his cowardice. He will not let another opportunity go to waste. I'm sure that at this point, many of you are asking the same question. How is it possible that someone can just follow the president around with a gun? Where is the Secret Service? Which certainly exists at this time, because everyone knows the oft-repeated factoid that Lincoln infamously signed the Secret Service into existence the night he got assassinated. Well, as it turns out, the Secret Service was originally created to protect the only thing that really matters in this country. In the 19th century, their responsibility was to identify counterfeit bills. The agency's modern role of protecting the president will only come about after the McKinley assassination in 1901. And why exactly did it take us so long to figure out this seemingly no-brainer policy? Well, for a long time, most Americans maintained the naive belief that the president did not need protection. This way of thinking was unique compared to the rest of the world. Across the pond in England, for example, 7 different men had tried to assassinate Queen Victoria over roughly the same time period. But Americans didn't like the idea of surrounding their leader with armed guards, as it evoked images of tyranny. Even Lincoln's death was excused by the unprecedented war that led up to it, and lawmakers refused to imagine that an assassination plot could occur during peacetime. It was widely understood that since the president was democratically elected, no one would have any good reason to forcibly remove them from power. What they never considered, however, was someone killing the president for an incredibly stupid reason. If one of America's many nutjobs happened to develop such an obsession, there was very little standing in their way. At each passing moment, President Garfield was at the complete mercy of his surroundings. No one was coming to save him. On July 2, 1881, the president was scheduled to depart on vacation from the Baltimore and Potomac train station. The event had been widely publicized by the press ahead of time, which Charles Guiteau read about and prepared for. He arrives at the station half an hour before the president and hides in the bathroom. When Garfield arrives alongside Secretary Blaine, Guiteau emerges, pulls out his gun, and opens fire. One bullet grazes Garfield on the shoulder, and another strikes him directly in the lower back. He stumbles over and falls to the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, the president has been shot. Pandemonium fills the station. Some people run for their lives, while others try to track down the shooter. As the crowd learns about the fate of the president, the sense of panic quickly turns to fury. Guiteau attempts to flee the scene, but runs directly into a police officer who takes him into custody. Had he roamed free for a moment longer, he likely would have been surrounded and lynched on the spot. Unlike many other deranged killers, Guiteau is quite interested in his own self-preservation. He certainly does not want to meet the fate of John Wilkes Booth, who was publicly slain after a week-long manhunt. On the contrary, Guiteau is more than content with sitting in jail under federal protection. He starts to fantasize about his future life as America's newest celebrity. Meanwhile, the President of the United States is lying face down on a train station floor in a pool of his own blood. People try to help him to his feet, but he simply collapses and starts profusely vomiting. A couple of doctors arrive on the scene. Unsure of how fragile the president's state is, they choose not to transport him to a hospital. Instead, they drag him onto a filthy old mattress in an abandoned room of the station and start examining him. Watching this whole scene unfold was a horrified Robert Todd Lincoln, who is now reliving the most traumatic moment of his life. Not knowing what else to do, he decides to summon another doctor, the only doctor he can recall at the top of his head. It's a doctor who was very difficult for most people to forget, because his name is Doctor. If you want to be remembered in the future, it helps to have a really stupid name. Dr. Willard Bliss was named after a local surgeon whom his parents admired. As if marked by prophecy, Doctor would grow up to become a doctor, and specifically a surgeon. He specialized in ballistic trauma and opened up a successful practice treating wounded soldiers from the Civil War. Less successful, however, was his track record while treating presidents. Thus far, he has extended his medical care to precisely 2 presidents, both of whom happened to die in office. But to be fair, each of these deaths happened independently of Dr. Bliss's actual treatment, and by all accounts, his expertise was well respected across the nation. His character, however, was the true cause for concern. Like Charles Guiteau, Dr. Bliss had developed quite an appetite for fame and fortune. But unlike Guiteau, he is a man of science, or at least his own personal brand of 19th century science. A long career has left Dr. Bliss rather arrogant and stubborn. He doesn't respect anyone else's medical opinion and always has to be in charge. He also lacks the integrity you'd expect from a man in his position. For years, he enriched himself by selling a snake oil-like product which he claimed could cure cancer. But despite his checkered past, many still believe that Dr. Bliss is the right man for the job. After all, he's a professional, and as we know, professionals can't possibly be incompetent. When Dr. Bliss arrives on the scene, Garfield's condition has actually improved significantly. He is alert and responsive, he has feeling in his extremities, and the bleeding has mostly stopped. By all indications, it appears that the bullet has missed his spinal cord and any vital organs or arteries. With this in mind, the doctors have an important decision to make. On one hand, they can simply choose to do nothing. They can presume that the bullet has landed in a benign place and let the wound heal naturally. After all, at this time there are thousands of Civil War veterans living normal lives under this exact circumstance. But now that Dr. Bliss is here, everyone is practically forced to go along with the other option, attempting to locate and extract the bullet lodged somewhere in the president's torso. Of course, Dr. Bliss is sort of known as the guy who extracts bullets, so you can't just bring him in to not do that. And besides, this is America, the land of medical intervention. We pay our doctors way too much for them to simply do nothing. The first thing Dr. Bliss does to Garfield is jam a comically long, unsterilized probing rod directly into the bullet wound. Under no anesthesia or painkillers, he drills the probe up and down until it's several inches deep in the president's back. When he tries to remove the probe, it gets stuck on one of Garfield's fractured ribs. Dr. Bliss then has to press down on the broken bones in order to free his Excalibur from the flesh. He then sticks his filthy, unwashed finger into the wound and swishes that around some more. After this, he picks up a second unsterilized probe and shoves it back in. It may be tempting to excuse Dr. Bliss for having to work within the scientific constraints of his time, but even that would be giving him too much credit. By 1881, germ theory had already been around for decades. As early as the 1860s, Dr. Joseph Lister had revolutionized surgery in Europe after discovering the process of antisepsis. He found that operating in a clean room with clean instruments dramatically reduced the patient mortality rate. The American medical establishment saw this data and simply chose to ignore it. Many surgeons like Bliss stuck to the medieval method of wiping your ass and then immediately touching someone's internal organs. In addition to his existing injury, Garfield now has to deal with a deep tissue bacterial infection that Dr. Bliss has so graciously introduced. His immune system might be able to fight it, but several factors are working against him. One is that Washington, D.C. is a disgusting hellhole. Every summer, the raw sewage that openly flowed into the Potomac River would get baked by 90-degree heat, causing the whole city to smell like literal shit. The surrounding swamps were infested with clouds of mosquitoes carrying malaria. If one were to bite Garfield in his current condition, his fate would certainly be sealed. The president's caretakers tried to seek refuge by moving him to the White House, although it was hardly the sanctuary you'd expect. At this point in time, the building has fallen into disrepair. The roof leaks, the plumbing is failing, and there are so many rats that the sound of them scurrying keeps people up at night. By now, most presidents refuse to even live there during the summer months. But Garfield, in his dire state, has been given no other choice. However, the single biggest threat to the president's survival is that Dr. Bliss has taken full control of his medical care. In doing so, he has temporarily become the most powerful man in America. From the moment he entered the room, Bliss has bestowed upon himself a quasi-power of attorney over President Garfield. He seized this position of supreme authority pretty much on his own, without any oversight or even permission from anyone else involved. As word of the shooting spreads around the nation, dozens of doctors travel to the White House to offer their expertise. But when they get there, Bliss turns them all away, refusing to even let them see the president. This included Garfield's personal physician who had been treating him for years. Any doctor who insisted on staying was forced to relinquish all medical control and become a glorified nurse. For Dr. Bliss, this authoritarian rule was necessary to ensure that no one else could steal his glory, for he and he alone shall reap the rewards of saving the president's life. Dr. Bliss has also decreed himself as the only official point of communication between the White House and the outside world. He now has the exclusive responsibility of relaying the president's status to the press. Naturally, it's just a matter of time before Bliss's statements have completely departed from reality. Every news bulletin he issues is always the same. The president is doing great, he's recovering just fine, and he's gonna be back on his feet any day now. But the truth of the situation, as you'd expect, is getting far more bleak. Garfield's temperature is hovering around the low 100s. He feels excruciating pain all over his body, and his condition is clearly deteriorating. Nearly every one of Bliss's medical recommendations is so baffling that they defy basic intuition, let alone physical science. You'd imagine that a wounded patient would be given soft and bland foods to eat in order to prevent an upset stomach. Dr. Bliss has decided to feed Garfield a diet of steak and lamb chops, which almost always lead to bouts of severe vomiting and distress. Garfield's condition is also causing him to rapidly lose fluids. The constant sweating, vomiting, and drainage of his infected wound are making him dehydrated. But this whole time, rather than giving the president, water, Dr. Bliss has been making him drink alcohol, which only dehydrates the body further. In addition to this, Garfield is also being administered regular doses of quinine, a toxic compound which is now known to carry a list of deadly side effects. Week after week, the president endures these conditions. When he's not in severe physical discomfort, he suffers from profound loneliness. The doctor rarely lets him see his family or his friends, and he spends the rest of his time stuck inside a sweltering room with hardly any views of the outside world. At times, the pure dysfunction of the situation does give way to some genuine brilliance. To help the president cool off, a team of engineers devised what is essentially the world's first air conditioner. But this breakthrough ultimately does little for Garfield's health. As the days continue to pass without improvement, Dr. Bliss decides to call in an expert. In 1881, Alexander Graham Bell is suffering from success. After inventing the telephone, he has made millions, but he hates the constant hassle of business. More of an idealist than a capitalist, he wants to focus his intellect on something that can benefit mankind by saving lives. When he learns that the president has been shot, he springs into action. Like Garfield, Bell is one of these true diamonds in the rough. Originally born in Scotland, he moves to the United States and becomes a prolific inventor, mostly specializing in accessibility tools for the deaf. He always had the desire to help people, and now the time has come for him to help the most important man in the nation. Had Garfield been shot just 14 years later, his doctors would have immediately been able to find the bullet through X-ray imaging, but for now, he's gonna have to settle for Bell's invention. It's a device that has been painstakingly crafted over the past several weeks. In front of the president and all of his doctors, Bell unveils the world's first metal detector. He has already successfully tested it on several Civil War veterans, and by all measures, it should work on the president. This is pretty much his last hope. Maybe after all the stupidity it's taken to get here, a genius is just gonna come in and bail us out at the last moment. But even now, after the smartest man in the world shows up on his doorstep to help, Dr. Bliss still finds a way to screw things up. He believes that the bullet is on the right side of Garfield's body, so he insists that Bell only use the metal detector on the right side. There is really no reason why he can't check Garfield's left side just to be sure. He's come all this way, invented a whole new thing. Why would you not use it as much as you can? But Dr. Bliss doesn't actually want results. He simply wants to be proven right. He needs to be the smartest man in the room, even if it involves sabotaging a real genius. And so, Bell runs the detector on Garfield's right side only, listening for the correct tone. He hears something, but it doesn't match the sound he remembers from his tests. It's a noise more similar to interference. He asks the doctors if all metal has been removed from the room, and they tell him it has. After this, Dr. Bliss has seen enough. He concludes that the detector has found the bullet precisely where he expected it, and quickly ushers Bell and his invention out the door. But as it turns out, there was metal in the room all along, as one of the mattresses supporting the president had steel springs, which totally threw off the detector. Oblivious to this fact, Dr. Bliss embarked on one final odyssey to remove the bullet once and for all, only to find nothing yet again. But even if Bell or Bliss had succeeded in finding the bullet, it's doubtful whether Garfield could have even been saved by this point. His body weight has fallen from 210 pounds to just 130. His once robust build has now withered into little more than a skeleton. Pus-filled abscesses have formed across his whole body. He can no longer consume any solid food and has to be sustained through rectal feeding. One doctor quietly confesses to the press that he's not sure how the president is still alive. While all this has been happening, Dr. Bliss has still been trying to assure the public that everything is fine and that a full recovery is right around the corner. By now, he doesn't even believe that he's convincing anyone. He's just trying to ride out his last moments of still having any sort of professional reputation. After 2 months of non-stop torture, Garfield finally decides that enough is enough. On September 5th, 65 days after the shooting, he demands to cease all treatment and leave the White House immediately. He will be loaded onto a special train and taken to the town of Elberon, New Jersey to experience the last moments of his life in peace. And with that, the president has officially checked himself into hospice. After 49 years of life, he finally accomplished his boyhood dream of making it to the sea. He spends his last days surrounded by friends and family just staring out over the ocean. Perhaps all along, he had only been running on borrowed time, ever since he fell off that boat into the dark and uncertain water. This time, as he was drowning, there was no rope to pull him back to safety. But even after meeting such a grim demise, he never lost his faith in other people. He never lost his gratitude for those who helped him, even Dr. Bliss. He never even harbored any resentment for Charles Guiteau. The world tried to take everything from him, as it does with most brilliant people, but it could not take his integrity. He held on to it until the bitter end. On September 19, 1881, James A. Garfield passed away, and America's forgotten presidential assassination had finally run its course. Wait a minute. No. This can't possibly be true. It has to be some kind of sick joke. Because you mean to tell me that Garfield died on a Monday? This is not just your ordinary everyday stupidity. This is profound stupidity. Cosmic stupidity, even. This has to be evidence of some malevolent creator that's just toying around with us. Why else would the most inspiring president we've ever had be condemned to die in such a hideous fashion? Was this all just divine punishment for slavery, or the demise of our native people, or some other sin that we committed along the way? It's no secret why this whole shit show was forgotten. If you've ever wondered why no one in America brings up the 1880s, this is why. Because the story it contains is so disgraceful that we all decided to erase the whole time period from our collective memory. Seriously, how did we ever recover from this? Well, it wasn't easy. For the 2.5 months that Garfield was incapacitated, the rest of the nation was essentially held hostage. This was well before the 25th Amendment, and no formal procedure existed for a scenario where the president could no longer perform his duties. The tradition established at the time was for the vice president to assume office upon the president's death. But during this whole ordeal, Chester Arthur is nowhere to be found. After the shooting, the public blamed Arthur and Conkling for orchestrating the whole plot as a desperate means of restoring power to the stalwart faction. Many now see Arthur's eventual succession as a thinly disguised coup, and the vice president has become the focus of considerable hatred. This intense scrutiny causes Arthur to have an emotional breakdown. He locks himself in his home for weeks and enters a deep depression. He knows he's not cut out to be president, and is terrified of what's going to happen if he does. The day of Garfield's death, reporters storm his house and find him sitting alone crying his eyes out. Moments later, Chester A. Arthur is sworn in as the 21st president, and the second in a row who never actually wanted the job. Nobody's expecting anything good to come out of his reign, but shockingly enough, Arthur has undergone a transformation. He vows to step out of Conkling's shadow and follow in Garfield's footsteps as a man of integrity. Just 2 years later, to Conkling's fury, Arthur signed sweeping civil service reforms into law. He also gave the White House some much-needed renovations. When his term expired, he did not seek re-election. He died just 2 years later at the age of 56. Following Arthur's betrayal, Roscoe Conkling pretty much gave up on politics altogether. He attended Arthur's funeral but never forgave him. Within 2 more years, he would die at the age of 58 after trying to walk to work in a blizzard. No one was happier to see Chester Arthur take office than Charles Guiteau. He has spent the past 10 weeks as the most hated man in America. Multiple people have tried to kill him, but he ironically has better security than the president ever had, so nothing comes of it. With Garfield now dead, the last phase of his plan is finally complete, and he expects to be pardoned for helping Arthur ascend to the throne. That pardon never comes, and Guiteau is forced to stand trial instead, which will certainly conflict with the nationwide celebrity speaking tour he has planned. Not a single lawyer in the country wants to defend him, except for his trusty brother-in-law who had always been there for him. For the next few months, Guiteau chimps out in court, berating the one ally he still has left. For a moment, there are serious concerns that he'll be let off the hook by reason of insanity, but I don't think America had enough troops to contain the riot which would have taken place if that actually happened. On January 25, 1882, Charles Guiteau was found guilty and sentenced to death. Even after this, he still believes that Arthur will eventually pardon him, all the way up until the day of his execution. He chooses to spend his final moments reciting another speech. As was the case with everything else in his life, no one had any clue what he was saying, so they just tuned him out. Charles Guiteau was put to death on June 30th, 1882, nearly 1 full year after the assassination. He was 40 years old. The day after Garfield's death, Dr. Bliss and company gathered around his remains to perform one final desecration. An autopsy was necessary to reveal just what the heck went so wrong for them. After slicing him open, they discovered, to their astonishment, that the bullet had actually been on the left side of his body the whole time. And on top of that, it had been safely tucked away in some benign scar tissue. They never even needed to remove it. Pretty much everywhere else on the corpse, the profound devastation they had inflicted on the president was fully revealed. The giant infected flesh tunnel they had bored into Garfield's back eventually resulted in catastrophic septic shock. His body had been literally rotting from the inside. It was a scientific marvel that he somehow lived as long as he did. For his blunderous job at saving the president, Dr. Bliss was ridiculed as the biggest quack in the nation. But despite getting served a career-defining humiliation, he never once apologized for totally butchering the most important assignment of his life, or repeatedly lying to the public. Much like Charles Guiteau, he refused to admit that he had done anything wrong. But unlike Guiteau, Dr. Bliss never faced any sort of justice. He wasn't tried for malpractice and he didn't lose his medical license. Like most terrible doctors in this country, he got away scot-free and was even paid for his efforts. He lived for 7 more years, eventually dying of a stroke at the age of 63. And as for his all-important legacy, let's just say he brought new meaning to the expression, ignorance is bliss.
Well guys, the operation is complete. But I couldn't save him. I did all I could.
According to all modern medical consensus, Garfield's bullet wound was easily survivable. If it happened now, he would have been treated and discharged in a matter of days. I suppose that's the most aggravating part of this whole story, just how preventable it was. Not just Garfield's treatment, but everything else leading up to it. Why did Charles Guiteau have to survive that shipwreck? How did he not end up in prison or a mental asylum? Why didn't a single person notice him stalking the president for weeks? At every step of the process, Garfield couldn't catch a single break. It really makes you wonder how close we were to potentially living in a drastically different future. Maybe if Garfield survives, he goes on to become one of the greatest presidents in history. Maybe the United States ends up getting free universal education in the 1880s rather than never at all. Maybe Garfield wins a second term and changes the outcome of every presidential election that succeeded him. Maybe Woodrow Wilson never gets elected. The US never gets involved in World War I, and the course of world history is completely altered. The whims of fate operate on very fine margins. Who knows where our destiny could have taken us if we had just been a little less stupid. For the few short months he spent leading the nation, President Garfield would look out of his office window to see an unfinished Washington monument. The project broke ground decades earlier and quickly ran out of money, so whatever was already built just got left there as this sad, ugly stump. Garfield would see this stupid thing day after day, even as he lay in bed dying. It symbolizes our reckless ambition, our short-sightedness, our inability to accomplish the most basic of tasks. They might as well have renamed it to the Idiot Monument, because that's what it represented. Garfield was certainly no stranger to idiots ruining his life, but he still maintained the patience that if you gave them enough grace, any idiot was capable of great things. I wonder if he could have guessed that the same idiot nation who built this eyesore and accidentally got him killed would end up lasting for 250 years. Could he have possibly imagined that the ragtag government who couldn't even protect their leader from a single gunman would one day grow so powerful that it is now feared the world over? The Washington Monument was eventually completed just 7 years after Garfield's death. It stood taller than any other structure on Earth. As was the case in Garfield's time, we find ourselves today living through a very stupid era of American politics. It feels like everything is falling apart, and no one in charge can do anything right. There's widespread corruption, greed, and hopelessness everywhere you look. These days, America could really use someone like Garfield, because it feels like we're stuck with an unending supply of Charles Guiteaus and Dr. Blisses. I must admit that for most of my adult life now, I've been getting more and more disillusioned with the current state of America. To help make sense of things, I've tried seeking guidance from the past, and from stories like this. Obviously, this particular one didn't do much to improve my mood, but it did lead me to one valuable insight. There existed a narrow slice of Americans who were alive to remember Garfield's incredibly stupid death. Some of them went on to experience deadly pandemics, economic collapse, and the most brutal wars ever fought. But a few of them, if they hung on long enough, would have witnessed this country put a man on the moon. Chaos, dysfunction, and ineptitude are nothing new. They've been around at every point in our nation's history. Brilliance, on the other hand, is truly rare. Few of us ever get to actually experience it. Most of us simply get to hear stories about it. It's important to cherish those few brilliant moments of life, because there's no guarantee you'll ever get another one. Anyway, here's to another 250 years of stupidity. Perhaps we may live to see America be brilliant again.